Rayna Mitchell, 26, had just saved a passenger's life, mid-flight. But when the plane landed, it wasn't gratitude she got. TSA pulled her aside, hands on their weapons, demanding to know how a black woman like her knew medical procedures, not meant for crew. The cameras were rolling. The passenger was silent. And Rayna? She saw something in one agent's hand, something she wasn't supposed to see. What happened next changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Raymond Elkins moved through the wide corridors of Stanford's mathematics building with a silent certainty. His mop bucket trailed behind him on the terrazzo floor, wheels whispering faint echoes in the hush between lectures. To most he existed in a gray fringe, janitor, caretaker, invisible background. Yet every so often, in the silence before a lecture or during the midnight hours, when the building lay deserted, he paused before a chalkboard, ran his fingers along complex equations left half erased, and smiled at the patterns no one else saw. He wore the standard uniform, navy blue overalls, a badge reading facilities services. His hair was peppered with gray, his eyes keen. He never intruded, he never announced himself. He went about his work, sweeping, mopping, tightening a loose screw on a door hinge. But he listened. The walls whispered theorems and proofs. Faculty and grad students left chalked margins in corridors and hallways. To Raymond, these weren't decoration, they were invitations. On a late Tuesday afternoon, after a long lecture in 401B, Professor Ethan Gentry stood before his class, expounding on a complex tensor identity. He had the podium command, the authority, the prestige, the soft applause from every student who hung on his every word. He scribbled symbols rapidly, parts of the derivation moving from one side of the board to the other. A student raised a hand. "Professor, could you clarify the second step, how you simplified the contraction over indices I and K?" Gentry paused, scrawled again, and then turned, under the fluorescent glare, to the class. "Let me restate. That contraction is valid, because the metric is symmetric. Now moving on." From the back of the room, nearly unnoticed, Raymond inhaled. He had swept the hallway just outside, but the door to 401B had been left slightly ajar. He'd stepped in quickly to grab a stray piece of chalk someone dropped. As he turned, he glimpsed Gentry's derivation, and saw an algebraic inconsistency, a missing factor, a misplacement of an index, a small error, but in a rigorously crafted lecture, fatal. Raymond let the chalk rest on his palm. He might have left it there. He might have walked away. Instead, he cleared his throat quietly, a sound so soft no one instantly noticed. All heads turned. Gentry looked up, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," someone said. A murmur rippled. Gentry stammered. "Who's there?" Raymond advanced 2 steps into the room. The students froze. The professor's lecture halted mid-sentence. The board's white margin lights flickered. "Professor, with respect," Raymond said, voice steady low. "Your step simplifying the contraction between I and K dropped a minus sign. The equality as written doesn't hold unless you include the curvature term you omitted." Silence. The room felt colder. The professor's jaw tightened. Students exchanged glances, mouths open, eyes wide. Some immediately began scratching notes, reworking the derivation themselves, checking Raymond's claim. Professor Gentry cleared his throat. "That's impossible. He stuttered. But Raymond held up his hand. "I've followed your lecture notes, and I ran that contraction this morning while cleaning the adjacent lab room. I saw the omission then, but didn't speak." The students ahead murmured, "He's right. Check your steps, Professor." Gentry flushed. He motioned to a chalk holder and wrote a slash through his prior line. He reworked the derivation slowly, in front of the class. Raymond leaned back against the wall, mop in hand, calm. He watched bodies shift in discomfort. When Gentry reached the corrected form, a few students nodded. Some scribbled in their notebooks, grateful. Others sat stunned, uncertain. The professor cleared his throat again. "Thank you for that correction," he said, voice tight. "I appreciate it." He did not invite Raymond forward. He did not ask for a name. He simply resumed the lecture. But the air had changed. As the lecture ended, students filed out. Some looked back, curious. Some whispered, "Who was he? Janitor. He must be mistaken." Raymond turned to leave, mop bucket in tow, but paused at the door. He glanced back at the board, where Gentry's corrected derivation stood in bold white chalk. The arc of satisfaction in his chest felt like quiet vindication. Outside in the hallway, the hush seemed louder. A few latecomers passed. Raymond resumed sweeping. But every so often, he looked back at the classroom door, hearing residual murmurs. Did you see that? Who was that guy? He just corrected a Stanford professor. Over the next few days, murmurs circulated. Some students posted within internal Stanford forums, "Janitor corrects professor in class. Who is this man? Proof or prank?" The story lingered like smoke from an extinguished flame. But for Raymond, this was nothing new. He had lived for these margins, unnoticed, uncelebrated, yet borne witness to brilliance and failure alike. He entered the janitor's closet, near room 405. It was cramped, functional. Mops, cleaning solutions, floor buffers, spare paper towels. Within its small shelf, tucked behind plastic jugs, lay his own notebook. It was not a diary of grievances. Instead, it held sequences, differential identities, margins filled with thought, equations scribbled in pencil that no one would ever read. Tonight, he would add the corrected contraction derivation, not to show off, but to polish his understanding. But as he reached into the shelf, he felt a weight behind him. Someone standing just outside the closet door. He froze. The lights in the corridor flickered. In the silence, footsteps hovered. He glimpsed a shadow shift. Raymond closed the closet silently, sliding the notebook inside. He gripped his mop handle tighter. He exhaled, slowly. He waited. The door's hinge creaked. A figure stepped away. Then the corridor lights went dim for a heartbeat. Before recovering, he slipped out, mop bucket rolling behind him. As he passed the lecture hall foyer, he noticed a smartphone screen glowing in a student's hand. The lecture room floor, Gentry teaching. And in the margin, "He's wrong," with a paw. He caught a faint reflection of his own silhouette framed in the screen, standing in the back row. The student didn't notice. He kept scrolling. Raymond's heart pinched, not from fear, but from recognition. Someone had filmed him in that moment. Someone had caught the correction, the silence that followed his voice. And now that someone had that file, inside that file was power. In it lay the question, what would they do with it? He walked down stairwells, past lecture halls, and dark corridors, his shadows trailing him, like silent companions. He reached the service entrance, and exited, fresh night air brushing his face. The campus beyond lay quiet, oblivious, unaware. But someone was watching, and he didn't find it funny. There were two types of authority at Stanford. The first came with credentials, titles, and tenures, the kind Dr. Ethan Gentry wore like a tailored suit. The second came in quiet wisdom, earned through sweat, loss, and sacrifice, the kind Raymond Elkins carried in his hands, calloused and weathered from a lifetime of cleaning institutions that had never once welcomed his mind. To Ethan Gentry, the line between those two realms wasn't just academic, it was personal. His lectures weren't just about mathematics, they were performances. Every proof was a stage, every question from a student, an audition. He had built his reputation on precision and arrogance, a lethal combination in the ivory towers of elite academia. So when a janitor, a black janitor, interrupted his lecture to correct his tensor contraction, the moment was more than inconvenient. It was heretical. He had smiled tight-lipped during the interruption. Let the man say his piece, he thought. Let the students witness the absurdity. But when he returned to the board and realized the correction was accurate, something deeper twisted inside him. Later that day, Gentry found himself in the faculty lounge, retelling the incident to two colleagues over coffee. "You should have seen it," he said, chuckling, voice laced with false amusement. Mop in hand, dustpan on his belt, and this man starts lecturing me about index placement. The audacity. He sipped slowly. I suppose next week the cafeteria worker will explain Lie algebras. One of his colleagues, Dr. Whitley, shifted uncomfortably. Was he actually correct? Gentry smirked. Sure, by accident. Anyone can get lucky solving half a line of math they don't understand. You know how it is. They didn't push further. No one did. Because challenging Gentry meant risking being humiliated, corrected mid-meeting, or worse, left out of co-authorships and panels. The man had built a fortress of fear around his ego, and within that he ruled uncontested. But what Gentry didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the moment hadn't stayed confined to those four chalk-dusted walls. A sophomore named Javier Langley, had filmed the entire interaction on his phone, tucked discreetly in his hoodie pocket. He hadn't meant to. He was recording the lecture to review tensor calculus later. But when Raymond stepped in and delivered that correction with the steady grace of someone who knew, Javier's phone kept rolling. The video captured everything. The hesitation in Gentry's face, the tension in the room, the equation being quietly rewritten with a muffled apology. And Javier, a neuroscience major who'd seen his own father dismissed as the cleaning guy at UCLA for years, knew the importance of that moment. He edited the clip that evening, added a simple caption, "Stanford janitor corrects tenured professor on tensor contraction," and he's right. He didn't post it to his main account. Instead, he uploaded it anonymously to a subreddit called Black Excellence Unfiltered. From there, it began its ascent like wildfire on a windy night. By midnight, the video had 13,000 upvotes. By dawn, it had crossed into Twitter. By noon, it was on TikTok. Different captions emerged. Why does this janitor know more than the professor? This is why black minds get erased. They never get the credit. Watch how quickly he tries to play it off. This is what institutional arrogance looks like. Within 24 hours, the video had reached over 2 million views. Comments flooded in, thousands of them. That man's probably smarter than everyone in the room. Why wasn't he the one at the front? America has been throwing away black brilliance for centuries. This is just one example. Imagine cleaning the floor of a place that wouldn't give you a seat. Some comments, of course, cut the other way. Probably staged. This isn't real academia. Stick to mopping. Just because you catch a math error doesn't mean you belong in the classroom. Raymond didn't see the video that night. He didn't have Twitter. He didn't spend his evenings on Reddit. He spent them at the kitchen table of his small rented duplex, sipping black coffee and solving equations from old physics journals borrowed from the university library. But his phone buzzed unusually often that evening. Missed calls from former coworkers. A voicemail from his niece in Oakland saying, "Uncle Ray, I think you're on the internet." When he finally checked, he saw his own face, frozen in a thumbnail frame, mop in hand, standing silently as a classroom fell still behind him. He listened to the video, watched his own voice play back, and something in his chest ached. Not pride, not embarrassment, but the hollow pain of recognition. Recognition that this was the only way people would believe he was worth listening to, by accident. Meanwhile, back at Stanford, Professor Gentry's day had taken a sharp turn. His inbox was flooded, not with academic inquiries, but with subject lines like, "Care to respond to this? You're trending. Sir, we have a PR issue." He clicked the link someone had sent, and there it was, the moment he'd hoped no one remembered. Now immortalized, slowed down, replayed, meme. His jaw clenched. He forwarded the video to the dean with the message, "This is being taken out of context." But the context wasn't the point. The public had already decided what the video meant. They saw arrogance met with quiet dignity. They saw an elite professor being corrected by someone his system would never hire. They saw years, decades of exclusion crystallized into one clean moment of poetic justice. And Gentry hated how powerless he felt. Later that day, as he tried to resume his next lecture, students sat differently. They no longer leaned in with awe. They watched cautiously. Some scribbled notes. Others stared with arms folded. One girl wore a hoodie with the words "The janitor was right" scrawled in black marker across the back. He opened with a forced joke. "Let's try tensor contractions again, shall we? I've double-checked them this time." A few students chuckled. Most didn't. He made it through the lecture, but not without noticing that his authority, once absolute, now had a crack. And once a crack forms, it spread. By 6 p.m., the university's communications department had emailed him, "We need to prepare a statement. Optics matter. Please coordinate." That night, Raymond sat at home, the video still open on his second-hand laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment he considered posting, saying something, telling people who he was, what he had studied, what he had lost, but he didn't. Instead, he closed the laptop and stared at the wall. Outside his window, the streetlight flickered. And across town, in a studio apartment filled with textbooks, another screen glowed, and a young man leaned forward, watching the clip again and again. He zoomed in on the man correcting the professor, zoomed in on his face, and then he whispered, barely audible, a name he hadn't spoken in 10 years. "Dad?" That night, someone posted the video, and it exploded online. Raymond Elkins never asked for attention. His world moved quietly, always in the margins. But the internet had a way of dragging the unwilling into its center. And once it did, there was no stepping back into the shadows. By Thursday morning, just 2 days after the correction heard round Stanford, the video had surpassed 6 million views. It was reposted across platforms, edited and re-edited, with new music, slow-motion cuts, text overlays like, "When brilliance wears a janitor's uniform. This is what being underestimated looks like. Einstein mopped floors too." But for every voice that praised Raymond's quiet intelligence, there were hundreds, thousands, that poured venom across the comment sections. It started as mocking, then curdled into something darker. "Stay in your lane, janitor. Affirmative action broom boy strikes again." I bet he Googled that equation. "Let's not pretend mopping floors makes you a genius." Probably some diversity hire in disguise. And then from the darker corners of the internet, just another loud black man looking for a handout. This is what happens when we let them into our institutions. Next thing you know, he'll demand tenure. Raymond read some of it at first with curiosity, then with increasing heaviness. The racism wasn't new to him, but its scale, the sheer avalanche of it, left something raw exposed. A wound reopened not because of anything he did, but because of who he was. What hurt most wasn't the name-calling. It was the effort to erase the truth behind the moment. People weren't just mocking him. They were rewriting what had happened. A growing narrative was being pushed. That Raymond had staged the correction. That it was a social experiment. That it was Dr. Stanford's official silence made it worse. The university issued no statement, no clarification, no acknowledgement that Raymond had been right. To them, he was still invisible. And yet, everyone else saw him. He was turned into a meme. Someone pasted his face over the chalkboard scene from Good Will Hunting, complete with the line, "Do you like mopping apples?" Another edited the clip into a rap remix. By Friday, he'd become a running joke in online STEM communities, a symbol not of brilliance but of mock audacity, a reminder that to some, a black man with a mop in a white institution could never be more than a punchline. Even inside Stanford, reactions were split. Some students started a petition demanding the university recognize Raymond's exceptional contribution to academic integrity. Others whispered about him in hallways, unsure if they were supposed to laugh or protest. But for the professors, the tenured elite, the video stirred something deeper than amusement. It stirred fear. If someone like Raymond could expose a professor's error, what did that say about them? Dr. Ethan Gentry, the man at the center of it all, doubled down. In a closed faculty meeting, he referred to Raymond's correction as opportunistic disruption. He was never part of the academic process, Gentry said sharply. This was not a peer-reviewed critique. It was performance, and we shouldn't be validating spectacles over scholarship. No one challenged him. Not openly. Yet in private, professors debated whether the university had a responsibility to vet the clip, to verify Raymond's identity, to control the damage. Raymond, meanwhile, kept working. He came to campus. He cleaned the halls. He changed nothing about his routine, but the stairs changed. Conversations halted when he passed. Some students smiled in admiration. Others sneered. Some whispered as he mopped, filming silently from behind lockers or doors. He could feel it in his bones. The attention wasn't honor. It was surveillance. Even other janitors began to treat him differently. Some with envy. Some with caution. One morning, while scrubbing a stairwell, a custodian named Harold leaned over and muttered, "You poked the wrong bear, man." Raymond looked up, sweat on his brow. "What bear?" Harold shook his head. "This place, these people, they don't forgive being embarrassed, especially not by someone like us." Raymond didn't answer. But he felt it, the cold weight of being seen not as human, but as disruption. By the weekend, things escalated. Someone posted a photo of Raymond's home, then his address, then his family members' names. Anonymous users dug into his employment history, mocking his incomplete college degree and the fact that he had once applied to Stanford's maintenance department with a handwritten resume. Others began sending emails to Stanford's administration, fabricated accusations that Raymond had harassed students, violated building codes, stolen supplies. Nothing stuck, but the volume was alarming. He began receiving anonymous calls. Silence on the other end. Then click. One voicemail said only, "Stay in your place." And yet, in all this chaos, a message slipped through the digital noise, almost unnoticed. It was a simple comment on the original Reddit thread. "I remember a Raymond Elkins from the math lab years ago. Brilliant mind. Should have been faculty. Anyone check the records? It was followed by another. This man tutored my son back in '09. Got him through differential equations when no one else could. The whispers of truth started to push back. But it wasn't until a third comment surfaced that everything shifted. I know who he is, and I know what Stanford did to his son. The comment was posted under the username AJCN Board 6. Most skimmed over it assuming it was just another troll. But Javier Langley, the sophomore who first posted the video, didn't skim. He read that comment 3 times. He clicked the profile. It was empty. No posts, no karma, no bio, but the username stuck with him. Board 64 wasn't common, and JCN, those initials matched something he'd seen in a school directory. So he did some digging. He searched Stanford's Board of Trustees. And there it was. James C. Norwell, trustee since 2009. Deep ties to the university's investment arm, longtime donor. A man whose name never appeared in campus controversies. Until now. Javier's heart raced. He checked again. That account had posted just once, that comment, and then deleted the profile. Someone high up knew who Raymond was, and they were trying to stay in the shadows. But one commenter wasn't anonymous, and had ties to Stanford's board. In a cramped apartment just outside Oakland, the glow from an old laptop screen lit the contours of Elijah Elkin's face. He hadn't meant to fall down the rabbit hole. He was supposed to be finalizing a dataset for a machine learning model he was training, but one Reddit post had pulled him off task, and now the silence in his studio was deafening as the video replayed, again and again. The clip wasn't long, barely 40 seconds. A janitor at Stanford correcting a professor, but it was the way the man stood, quiet, grounded, unflinching, that tugged something loose in Elijah's chest. Then came the voice, deep, calm, careful with each word like the sentence was a delicate machine. He didn't need to replay it to be sure. That was his father, Raymond Elkins. Elijah hadn't said his father's name aloud in nearly 7 years. Not since he'd left Stanford in the dead of night, with no ceremony, no farewell, no degree, just a silent exit from a world that had promised opportunity but delivered something else. Back then he'd been a prodigy, the youngest black doctoral candidate in the Stanford mathematics department. People whispered his name, with reverence and envy. Elijah Elkins, the kid with the theoretical mind. He had ideas that bent around corners, thoughts that moved faster than most people could follow. But inside the halls of academia, brilliance was never enough. Not for someone like him. They praised his intellect in public, but questioned his independence in private. They invited him to conferences, but introduced him as the kid from the diversity track. He was offered mentorships that felt more like surveillance, guidance that came with caveats, praise that always felt like permission slips. Still, he pressed on. For 2 years he stayed late in research labs, filled notebooks with ideas that his peers couldn't crack. He built models in topology that startled visiting faculty. He'd nearly finalized a dissertation that explored chaotic behaviors in high-dimensional spaces, a field no one his age had touched at his level. But it was in those same years that something else happened. Quietly, slowly, like erosion. His father's name came up in a closed-door department conversation. A professor had asked, "Raymond Elkins, any relation?" Elijah had paused, then said flatly, "No." It was easier. Safer. Because Elijah had already heard what they said about custodial staff behind their backs. The jokes about custodial chromosomes, the casual slurs tossed around after hours, the way some professors stepped over workers like they were floor stains. He didn't want that name attached to him. Not here. Not where he was already fighting to be seen as more than an exception. So he denied the truth. Not to shame his father, but to protect him. To protect himself. To try and keep something sacred from being chewed up by a place that would never understand the man who'd taught him calculus in a garage when he was 11. But academia has a way of finding your cracks. And one of Elijah's was named Ethan Gentry. Gentry had been the faculty lead on Elijah's dissertation panel. On paper, he was a brilliant mind. Sharp, connected, respected. But behind closed doors he had a talent for diminishing. Gentry rarely offered feedback. When he did, it was curt, ambiguous, not rigorous enough. Rework this. Think less like a student, more like a scientist. He never elaborated, never praised. Then, just months before Elijah was set to defend his dissertation, Gentry claimed Elijah's work showed borrowed logic, suggesting that it had been heavily influenced by papers written under Gentry's own name. The claim was vague, unprovable. But in a department that thrived on gatekeeping, it was Elijah was given a choice: delay his defense indefinitely, or withdraw voluntarily and resubmit in 2 years. He never got the second chance. No one filed a report. No paper trail existed. His name slowly faded from departmental emails. His office was reassigned within weeks. And like that, Stanford's youngest black math PhD candidate disappeared. He never told Raymond the full story. Just said, it wasn't the right fit. Raymond had nodded, the way fathers do when they know their sons are protecting them from the whole truth. In the years since, Elijah rebuilt a life. He consulted for small tech firms, taught night classes, coded under pseudonyms, ghost-wrote grant proposals. But his name, his real name, never regained the weight it once had. Now, as he watched the video, saw Raymond correcting Gentry, the same man who had dismantled Elijah's career, the past surged like a broken dam. He paused the clip, rewound, froze the frame where his father stood in the doorway, mop in hand, eyes fixed on the equation. The same calm eyes that had taught Elijah to find patterns in chaos. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then put it down. The world was watching his father, but they didn't know who he was. They didn't know why that moment mattered. They didn't know that Elijah had walked those same halls, once believing brilliance alone would be enough. Outside, the city hummed. Car horns, sirens, neon signs flickering across the window. Elijah stood and crossed to a dusty bookshelf, pulled down a journal, his old research notebook, and flipped to the final pages. There it was. The equation. The same one Raymond had corrected in the video, but written years before that lecture. In Elijah's own hand, he stared at the handwriting. His breath caught. Raymond didn't just correct that equation by chance. He remembered it. He remembered Elijah's work, even after all those years, which meant he had kept it, had studied it, protected it, not for pride, not for fame, but for love. Elijah sat back down, hands trembling. He opened a blank document on his laptop and began to type, not an essay, not a report, but a letter, to the Stanford Ethics Committee, to the press, to anyone who would listen. He titled it, Legacy Denied: What Stanford Stole from My Family. Then his phone buzzed. A new email. No subject.
No body text.
Just a link. He clicked. A private Stanford forum. Invite only. The thread title read, Custodian Situation, Handling the Optics. Dozens of replies. Among them, verify any family connections. Elkins, wasn't there a student once? If anyone has links to Elijah Elkins, flag it now. This story cannot gain traction beyond Reddit. We need to scrub any academic overlap. Contain this before the media connects the dots. And then one reply, marked confidential. He was my advisee. We resolved the situation years ago. He has no standing. Signed, E. Gentry. Elijah's hands froze. The man who sabotaged his career was still covering his tracks.
And Elijah just saw the video.
Elijah Elkins hadn't walked onto the Stanford campus in nearly a decade. But as his shoes touched the familiar slate-tiled sidewalk outside the Gates Computer Science building, it all came rushing back. The architecture, the air, the quiet condescension that lived in the brick. It wasn't nostalgia. It was muscle memory. He knew every shortcut between departments, every vending machine that still ate quarters, and every professor who once shook his hand like he was an exhibit. The promising young mind, the black mathematician, the anomaly. Now he walked back not as a student, not as a statistic. He walked in with purpose, and this time, he wasn't leaving quietly. His black denim jacket flared slightly in the breeze as he crossed through the main quad. He didn't wear a badge or carry a notebook. There was no lanyard to identify him, no department to welcome him back. But students glanced up as he passed. Something in his posture, his calm focus, made them look twice. He didn't walk like a visitor. He walked like someone who belonged, and more than that, like someone who had once owned this space and had it ripped from under him. Inside the Department of Mathematics, the walls still smelled like stale chalk and overconfidence. The carpet was newer, the couches replaced, but the names on the office doors were almost identical. And there it was, E. Gentry, Ph.D., etched in bronze, unchanged, untouched by time or consequence. Elijah didn't knock. Not yet. He wasn't ready to confront the thief until he had proof the system had helped him steal. Instead, he turned left and took the back stairwell 2 floors down toward the registrar's archives. It was a quiet corridor, with old bulletin boards still pinned with outdated exam schedules and faded lost calculator flyers from students long gone. The registrar's office looked more like a records library than a digital hub. A woman behind the front desk, no older than 30, glanced up when he entered. "Hi, I'm looking to access graduate records," Elijah said, his tone polite but firm. The woman tilted her head. "You a student?" "I was," he replied. "Elijah Elkins, class of 2015. Math PhD candidate. I'm requesting access to my archived academic file." She typed into her terminal. "ID." He pulled out an old laminated card, worn edges curled. She squinted, then nodded. "Hold on." She disappeared behind a glass panel door. Elijah exhaled slowly and looked around. A bulletin board still had a quote from Gentry framed in the center. "We don't recruit geniuses, we refine them." It burned something inside him. The woman returned, holding a slim manila file. "Your file's thin." Elijah's eyebrows twitched. "Thin?" She handed it to him. He opened it at the counter, careful and deliberate. The folder should have contained transcripts, dissertation proposals, advisor memos, internal reviews and peer commentary. Instead, it held only a few pages, his admission letter, 2 semesters' worth of grades, and a note that read, "Candidate withdrew voluntarily. No academic standing retained. No dissertation submitted." He flipped the page again. That was it. "Where's the rest of it?" he asked, voice sharpening. The registrar blinked. "This is what we have." "No, that's not possible. I submitted a dissertation outline. I defended a partial thesis. I had faculty reviews. There were meetings, emails, progress reports, drafts. I was almost finished." She looked at him uncertain. "If it wasn't filed through the official channel, it wouldn't be archived here. You could try speaking to your department directly." He stared at the folder. They'd erased him. Not just neglected. Erased. He closed the file, lips pressing into a hard line. "Can I keep this?" "It's a copy," she said. "Sure." He thanked her and stepped out into the hallway. The file trembled in his hands. It didn't matter how much he had written, how close he'd been to making history. On paper, Elijah Elkins never existed in Stanford's PhD program. Beyond year 2. No notes. No citations. No proof of theft. Just silence. He took a seat on a nearby bench, opened his laptop, and pulled up his saved copy of the Reddit thread. The comment from JCN Board 64 looped in his mind. "I know who he is, and I know what Stanford did to his son." Whoever had written that knew something. More than speculation. More than rumor. It was deliberate. But if Stanford had erased him from their own records, maybe that was because someone higher up knew what had happened and had helped bury it. He scrolled again through the anonymous forum leaks Javier had forwarded to him. One line caught his eye. "If anyone has links to Elijah Elkins, flag it now." That meant they were still tracking the risk. Elijah wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a threat again. But a threat to what? That's when something clicked. He pulled up his old dissertation outline from a hard drive archive he'd rescued years ago. In it were citations, original derivations, proofs no one had touched. Or so he thought. He opened Google Scholar, typed in a keyword unique to his work, multi-layered tensor field instability, under nonlinear chaotic shift. Only 2 results came up. One was his original submission to the Stanford Review Board in 2014, archived in an open repository with no academic standing. The second? A published paper, dated, authored by E. Gentry. His hands went cold. He clicked the paper. The title had changed. The language was slightly restructured. But the work? The math? The citations? The ideas? They were his. His stolen blueprint, rebranded and polished, now sitting in a peer-reviewed journal, with Gentry as the sole author. And below the title, in the acknowledgments section, a chilling sentence. This work builds upon informal notes shared in an early departmental seminar in 2014. No further collaborative contributions were made. Informal notes. He'd reduced Elijah's entire body of work to a footnote. Elijah sat frozen. He wasn't crazy. He hadn't imagined it. The theft was real, but Stanford had helped make it legitimate. The anger that rose in his chest wasn't rage. It was grief. Old and familiar, now awakened with new clarity. They hadn't just erased him. They'd repackaged him. Sold his legacy to the very man who pushed him out. He closed his laptop and it was time to pay a visit. But not to Gentry, not yet. First, he needed someone who had authority over the archives, someone who signed off on removals, someone who knew why his name had vanished from the records. He needed to find the registrar again, and this time not the front desk. The master registrar. The one with clearance. He turned, footsteps echoing. Not fast but sure. Because before he confronted the man who wore his work like a trophy, he needed to reclaim the proof. But first, he needed to find the registrar and dig up the past. The hallway to the registrar's executive offices was quieter than the rest of the building, like sound itself had learned not to overstep. The walls were lined with awards Stanford had given itself, plaques and certificates boasting about innovation, integrity, diversity. Elijah passed them without blinking. He had once believed those words. He had once thought excellence alone would protect him. Now he knew better. He reached the frosted glass door labeled Office of Academic Records, Archives and Clearance. It didn't open to just anyone. Students rarely even knew it existed. Elijah had only been there once, during his second year, to file a joint authorship form. That form no longer existed in his official record. Like everything else about his academic life, it had vanished. He knocked. A moment later, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and a quiet demeanor opened the door. Her nameplate read, C. Winchell, Senior Register. She looked him over, then offered a neutral nod. Can I help you? Elijah straightened. Yes. I'm requesting a review of my archived academic records. There are discrepancies I need clarified. Her brow furrowed. Name. Elijah Elkins. PhD candidate, mathematics, advised by Professor Ethan Gentry. Something flickered behind her eyes. A pause too long to be casual. We don't usually handle student requests here directly. You should go through the main office. I already did, Elijah said evenly. They gave me an incomplete file. Entire sections of my record are missing, including thesis submissions, proposal approvals, and interdepartmental memos. I believe they were removed intentionally. She stared at him, then turned without a word and walked into the office. Elijah followed. The space was dimly lit, lined with cabinets, and humming with the low purr of old database servers in the back. Miss Winchell typed something into her terminal. Elijah Elkins, she murmured. Let's see. A long silence. Then, you were here until spring. Yes. You were on the PhD track, but there's a note voluntary withdrawal.
That's false.
She hesitated. There's no thesis in your record. No committee reviews. Nothing past your third semester. Elijah leaned forward. Because someone removed them. She glanced up, eyes scanning his face. She'd worked at Stanford for 30 years. She knew the difference between a student whining about a grade and someone standing on the edge of something bigger. Who do you believe did this? Eliminated my records? Reattributed my work? You know the answer? She didn't respond. I need access to departmental communications from 2014 to 2015, Elijah said. Internal memos, authorship drafts, submission logs, anything that was archived digitally. That's restricted. You said my file was empty, which means this office has nothing to lose by pulling deeper. She sighed, then stood. Come with me. She led him into the server room behind the records area. It was cold, dense with cables and machines blinking in steady rhythm. She logged into a terminal, scanned her keycard, and typed again. We keep redundant logs of thesis document activity, she explained. Every draft submitted to a faculty advisor is logged with a metadata stamp. Even if the file is deleted, the event remains in the archive. Lines of code scrolled rapidly across the screen. Elijah Elkins. Gentry access. She leaned back. There were 12 files submitted between October 2014 and March 2015. All tagged with your student ID. All reviewed or opened by Dr. Ethan Gentry. But none of those files exist anymore. They were deleted, scrubbed. But not in the usual way. She tapped the screen, highlighting code. This was an administrator-level override. Someone with system-level clearance, requested total erasure, skipped the trash bin, bypassed recovery. That's highly irregular. Elijah stared at the screen. Can you see when? She nodded. March 19th, 2015. The same day your withdrawal was logged. He felt like the air had thickened around him. Do you keep snapshots? She paused, then gave a slight nod. Old ones. Off-grid. Backup tapes we're technically not supposed to access. But yes, there's a chance. She rose and walked to a wall unit. opened a long drawer filled with hard drives labeled by month and department. Elkins, math. She pulled one out, inserted it into a reader, waited. The computer pinged. Files. Old ones. Most were raw text. Auto-saved documents with names like Draft 3E She and Dissertation V2 Final. She clicked one open, and there it was. The equation. The one that had gotten Elijah shunned. The one Gentry called unprovable. Only now, published under his own name. Elijah stepped closer to the screen, heart pounding. That paper had been the culmination of 2 years of research. A multi-dimensional tensor symmetry reduction theorem that defied prior modeling limits. It had stunned 2 visiting scholars. One had even encouraged Elijah to publish it solo. Instead, it had been stolen, rebranded, stripped of his name. And there, buried in the metadata of the file, was a tracked comment, "Needs polishing. Let me see how this would look under my current publication outline." Elijah stepped back. "You see this?" he said quietly. "This is theft." Miss Winchell nodded. "Yes, it is." "Why didn't anyone stop it?" She didn't answer. But her eyes said it all. Because Stanford doesn't stop its own predators. It buries their footprints. Elijah turned toward her. "I need a copy of this. All of it. Every file. Every log." She hesitated. "If this goes outside, it has to go outside." She nodded slowly and began downloading the files onto a secure thumb drive. "You're going to get pushback," she said. "You'll be called angry, unstable. They'll say you're weaponizing race, that you're bitter." "I'm not bitter," Elijah said. "I'm the proof they tried to erase." He took the drive, held it tight. "Thank you." She looked at him. "You're not the first student I've seen walk out broken. But you might be the first who came back to burn the building down." He left the office walking fast, the cold air now bracing, electric. He had what he needed. Evidence. The kind that didn't care how many tenure boards protected Gentry. The kind that wouldn't die in whispers. But as he reached the stairwell, his phone buzzed. A new email. No subject. No sender. He opened it. It contained a single sentence. "Drop this, or your father loses his job." "That advisor?" "Dr. Ethan Gentry." The thumb drive felt heavier than it should have. Not in weight, but in consequence. As Elijah Elkins stepped out of the registrar's archive room and into the pale afternoon light filtering through the courtyard trees, he knew he was holding more than just a collection of digital files. He was holding a narrative Stanford had spent years trying to delete, and the receipts to prove it. But the threat in his inbox changed the air around him. "Drop this, or your father loses his job." He stared at the screen longer than he should have, feeling the quiet violence in those 12 words. No signature, no traceable metadata, just the kind of veiled institutional threat Stanford had mastered over decades. Not overt, not actionable, but unmistakably clear. This wasn't about academic dishonesty anymore. This was legacy warfare. They weren't just trying to protect Gentry. They were trying to destroy the evidence of a black man who dared to exist beyond the limits they'd quietly imposed. Elijah moved quickly through the campus, cutting across the quad toward the old engineering building. He didn't flinch when students glanced his way. He met their eyes now. Every step carried more purpose, more fury layered beneath restraint. The Stanford sun still kissed the polished courtyards, like everything was fine, as if nothing unjust could ever grow here. But he knew better, because he had lived inside the belly of this place. Back when he was a rising star, there were subtle patterns, the empty lab invitations, the unexplained reschedulings, the group texts he wasn't included in, the recommendation letters that never got sent. Each incident was minor, deniable. But together they told a story, one Stanford never wrote down, but enforced all the same. It started with a smile. A professor once told him, "You're remarkably articulate for your background." Another had said, "You must be so proud to be here, representing so many." At first he brushed it off. The pressure to be grateful smothered any urge to call it out. And then came the moments that couldn't be laughed away. His access card mysteriously stopped working for the lab he'd spent months in. He submitted a paper with 3 co-authors. Only their names made it onto the conference presentation. He'd raise questions during group meetings, and be talked over, dismissed or corrected by peers, quoting his exact points minutes later. And yet every time he thought of pushing back, something stopped him. Something deep and generational. He couldn't afford to be the angry black scholar. He couldn't risk losing the one seat at a table he wasn't sure was even real. Now he saw it clearly. The theft hadn't begun with Gentry's stolen publication. That was the final blow. The beginning was quieter, institutional, disguised as mentorship, packaged in praise. It was always, let us guide you. Let us refine you. Let us shape your voice. But only within the lines we approve. But Elijah had never wanted to be shaped. He wanted to expand. And for that, they'd made him pay. He reached the engineering building and entered a side door few people used. A hallway that led to the room where he'd once led a breakthrough seminar on nonlinear systems. It was dusty now, unused. But the whiteboard still held faint traces of equations, ghosts of ideas left behind. He stared at the board. 10 years ago, he had written something here. Something that stunned even his critics. A reduction formula that simplified complex tensors in unstable fields. A formula Gentry now claimed as his own. And then came a voice, soft behind him. You always came back to this room. Elijah turned. Standing near the door, with a worn satchel slung over his shoulder, was Malik Rios, a former classmate, one of the few other black PhD candidates during Elijah's time. He hadn't aged much, though his hair now held specks of gray. His presence was unexpected, but it wasn't unwelcome.
Malik?
Elijah blinked. I saw the video, Malik said, stepping closer. Didn't believe it at first. Then I saw the Reddit threads. The papers. I knew it had to be you. Elijah's voice was quieter now. They erased everything. Malik nodded slowly. They tried, but not completely. He pulled out a folder, old, thick, dog-eared, and placed it on the nearby table. I don't know if you remember, Malik continued, but during your final semester, you let me read a draft of your thesis. Said you wanted someone outside the department to check the logic chain. Elijah's breath caught. I saved it, Malik said. I've kept it all these years. I didn't understand all of it, but I knew it was significant. He opened the folder. Inside were printed pages of Elijah's dissertation draft, with original notations, dates and even margin notes in Elijah's handwriting. There were also screenshots of early emails between Elijah and Gentry, discussing the project timeline, including one where Gentry wrote, "This is going to shake the field. We'll present it as joint work. Trust me." Joint. Until it became solo. Until Gentry found it inconvenient to share credit with a student whose presence drew too many questions. Elijah's eyes scanned the pages, his throat tightening. This is more than I ever hoped for, he whispered. You're not alone, Malik said. There are others who saw it, who remember. They won't speak unless they have to. But if you bring this forward, they might. Elijah nodded. Slowly, gratefully. He now had two kinds of proof. The digital record, and the human testimony. And with that, the silence Stanford relied on was cracking. But Malik wasn't finished. He pulled out one final page, a printed email chain between Dr. Gentry and a faculty committee member. In it, Gentry made a chilling request. If Elijah withdraws, we should clean up any authorship confusion around his earlier drafts. It's for the department's protection. We'll handle it quietly. Malik looked at Elijah. They knew. They all knew. Elijah held the page like it might burn through his skin. The institution that had lifted him as a model minority had turned him into a ghost the moment he threatened their image. They had weaponized procedure, politeness, and policy, all to uphold a narrative where the only kind of black brilliance allowed was the kind they could control. But no more. Elijah stood up straighter. He had the files, the witnesses, the proof, and now he had the fire. They wanted this buried, Elijah said quietly. But I'm going to make it public. Every part of it. Malik stepped back, a smile creeping into the corner of his mouth. About time someone did. But even as the weight of validation settled in, Elijah's phone buzzed again.
A text, unknown number.
This time, no threats. Just a link to a brand new op-ed published in the Stanford Chronicle. Dr. Ethan Gentry, the reluctant genius behind tensor breakthrough. Sources confirm that Gentry's 2016 paper was based on years of silent private research. Allegations of misconduct are baseless, say university officials. They were already rewriting the story. Doubling down, sanitizing the theft in real time. Elijah turned to Malik, eyes hardening. They're trying to get ahead of me. Malik's reply was sharp. Then you better move faster. But Elijah had proof, and he wasn't the only one. Elijah stood beneath the shadow of Hoover Tower, Stanford's iconic spire rising like a monument to prestige and selective memory. In his pocket were two things that didn't belong together: a flash drive loaded with his stolen work, and a printed op-ed branding, Ethan Gentry, a reluctant genius. But tonight, something else was stirring. He stared at the encrypted email on his screen, sent from an anonymous Proton Mail account. Subject: they kept everything. I was there. Body: Gentry's lies go deeper than you think. I have internal files. Meeting room audio. You're not crazy. I'll meet you. 8:30 p.m. East Campus boardroom. Alone. The final line chilled him. What they buried, I helped dig up. But I'm ready to speak. He checked the timestamp. 30 minutes from now. Elijah took a deep breath and started walking. The East Campus boardroom wasn't used often. A glass-walled space tucked beside the administrative annex, where donor calls and discreet meetings took place far from student eyes. Few undergraduates even knew it existed. He arrived early. The hallway leading to the boardroom was quiet. Security lights buzzed overhead. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, he saw the long mahogany table, 12 chairs perfectly aligned. Everything was too pristine, like the place had been sanitized of any trace of conflict. He stepped inside. The lights flickered on, automatically. He stood at the head of the table and waited, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Then at precisely 8:30 the door clicked. A figure entered. Mid-40s. Black-rimmed glasses. Stanford ID clipped to a sweater vest. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Dr. Carlin? It was Lena Carlin, the former assistant to the chair of the mathematics department. A name he hadn't heard in years, but remembered now in startling detail. She had been there at every committee meeting, always taking notes, always quiet. You worked under Gentry, Elijah said cautiously. She nodded. I did. I was in the room when they decided your future. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers gripped a folder tight enough to crumple its edges. I've been watching the story unfold, she continued. But what they're saying about you in the Chronicle, it's not just spin. It's a preemptive strike. They know you have proof, and they know if you speak first, they lose control. Elijah stepped closer. Why now? She hesitated. Because it wasn't just about you. It was about a pattern. I've seen it happen to others. Grad students, junior faculty, visiting scholars, anyone who made the department uncomfortable. But you were the one they had to erase completely, because if your equation was proven valid, it would mean Gentry's entire career rested on a lie. She handed him the folder. Inside, printed emails, meeting transcripts, authorship logs. One thread caught his eye, immediately. Dated March 16, 2015. Gentry, replying to Department Chair D. Kozlov. Elijah's draft has potential, but he's already missing committee deadlines. We may want to suggest withdrawal. Quietly, of course. Better now than let it embarrass the department later. Another line from Kozlov. Understood. Clean separation. Minimal fallout. Just make sure he doesn't contest authorship. Those ideas are untested anyway. Elijah clenched his jaw. Carlin reached into her bag and pulled out something else. A USB stick labeled meeting audio. You were never supposed to hear this, she said. It was a closed-door meeting. You weren't even allowed to attend. But I kept the audio. She clicked open her laptop, inserted the drive, and played the file. At first, the sound was static. Then came voices. Gentry's, sharp and condescending. He's brilliant, but reckless. And let's be honest, nobody's gonna believe it came from a janitor's kid anyway. Elijah's breath caught. The room fell silent except for the playback. We give it a few months. Publish under my name. Let it be inspired by a previous student. Nobody digs deeper, especially not if we cut him a clean exit. Then another voice. Uncertain, perhaps Dr. Shin from Applied Mathematics. This feels wrong. He did most of the modeling. Gentry again. He did the math, I did the thinking. The audio clicked off. Elijah looked up, his eyes dark, focused. Carlin said nothing at first. Then I wanted to come forward years ago. But there were consequences. I had student loans. A disabled mother. Gentry ran this department like a monarchy.
You were afraid.
She nodded. And you're not anymore. She looked at him, eyes brimming. No. Because when I saw your father in that video, I realized they tried to erase both of you. And if they succeed, they'll do it again. Elijah leaned back, the weight of everything he had just heard settling into him like concrete. The room that had once been a sanctuary of decisions had now become a tomb of secrets. He had the proof now, more than just equations and drafts. He had their words, their complicity, their corruption. They'll deny it, he said. They already are, Carlin replied. But there's one thing they can't deny anymore. What's that? She reached into her bag once more and pulled out a flash drive. Elijah, she said softly, I filmed the day you first presented the tensor reduction theory in that seminar. They told me to delete it. I didn't. His eyes widened. You have video? She nodded. It shows you walking through the proof. Gentry nodding, even calling it visionary. The timestamp's embedded. It predates his publication by 14 months. It was more than proof. It was a weapon. Because academia worshipped one thing above all else. Timestamps. Authorship. Priority. And Elijah had them all now. He stood up slowly. His hands trembled. Not from fear, but from decades of silence finally unraveling. I'm taking this public, he said. Carlin nodded. I'll back you. There are others who will too. They just need to see someone else move first. As Elijah packed the evidence into his bag, she looked at him once more. They'll come for your father, she said. You know that, right? I know, he said quietly. But they already came for me. This time I get to answer. Just then, Carlin's phone buzzed. She checked the screen. Her face went pale. Elijah leaned in. What is it? She turned the phone toward him. A breaking news alert. Stanford launches internal investigation into alleged academic misconduct. Source, anonymous tip from board trustee. Elijah blinked. Wait. That wasn't us. Carlin looked up. No, she said. It wasn't. The whistleblower wanted to meet. Tonight. The headlines moved faster than Elijah anticipated. By morning, the Chronicle, Inside Higher Ed, and even BuzzFeed News had picked up the investigation story. But they didn't name names. Not yet. The phrasing was cautious, clearly shaped by Stanford's legal team. Anonymous allegations of academic misconduct, tied to a prominent faculty member within the mathematics department, are under review, sources say. The story was alive, but it wasn't real to the world yet.
Not until Elijah made it real.
He stood in the back row of the main Stanford library, scanning archives, surrounded by old academic journals, while tabs flickered on his laptop, side-by-side timelines, publication dates, co-authorship databases. His own erased name now haunted him in negative space, conspicuous only by its absence. But what started as a personal search for justice quickly morphed into something bigger. Elijah wasn't just finding gaps in his own story. He was uncovering a pattern. He found another student, Jamal Cross, class of 2010, brilliant in computational modeling, never graduated, left mid-program, with disciplinary discrepancies. His final thesis idea, shockingly similar to a published piece by one of Gentry's protégés 2 years later. Then there was Nina Barrington, who had co-authored a groundbreaking paper on adaptive quantum algorithms, except her name disappeared after peer review. The lead author later became a full professor, a white man who'd once mentored her through tough revisions. Each of them had walked the same halls, sat in the same rooms, had their voices heard, only to be overwritten. And every time the pattern was surgical. Praise in private, exclusion in public. Stanford's brochures were plastered with slogans like excellence through diversity. They showed smiling black and brown students in lab coats and caps. But inside, those same students were cornered by subtle sabotage. Emails left unanswered. Recommendations left unsigned. Funding redirected. Errors in administrative paperwork that never happened to anyone else. Elijah documented it all. He spoke to 4 alumni willing to go on record, off the record. Each had their own version of erasure. One called it academic redlining. You're allowed into the neighborhood, she'd said bitterly. But you're never allowed to own a house. In every conversation, Elijah kept hearing a phrase that made his stomach twist. They said I just wasn't quite ready. It was the same phrase Gentry had told him during their final meeting. Not wrong. Just not quite ready. That's how the system worked. They didn't kick you out violently. They escorted you out politely, with handshakes, with fake empathy, with a door they quietly locked behind you. Elijah wasn't chasing a personal vendetta anymore. He was unraveling a machine. And then he found something that made the machine personal again. A 1997 report buried deep in the university's HR archives. He only found it because Millick had access to the internal job application system and pulled up Raymond's original custodial application. Handwritten, modest, barely 1 page. But attached to the file was a red-flagged internal note. Raymond Elkins is overqualified. Applied twice before, rejected due to suspicion of attempting to use position to access academic spaces. Strong math background noted. Caution advised. Elijah's hands froze. They had known, even before Raymond became the janitor. They had known who he was, what he was capable of, and they'd flagged it as a threat. This wasn't just academic theft. This was generational erasure. He dug deeper. In the HR complaints archive, only accessible with an administrator's override, which Carlin discreetly helped him with, he found 3 separate records where faculty had raised concern about Raymond being seen reading math textbooks in staff areas or engaging students in technical conversations. Each time, the complaint ended the same way. Mr. Elkins was reminded of role expectations. No further action taken. Reminded of role expectations. In other words, stay in your lane. Elijah sat in the silent library, shoulders stiff, hands shaking. His father had been carrying the weight of the institution's silent bigotry for over 20 years. Not just cleaning rooms, but cleaning up behind people who had stolen the intellectual futures of others like him. In Elijah, he'd walked right into the same pattern, thinking he could be the exception. But the system didn't allow exceptions, only illusions of inclusion. Now the image of Raymond standing in that classroom doorway, mop in one hand and an equation correction in the other, took on a whole new meaning. That moment wasn't just bold. It was defiant. A man who had been forced into silence for decades, finally speaking, not to get attention, but because he couldn't let a lie stand. And still, even in that truth, the world mocked him, made him a meme, a joke.
Affirmative action, broom boy.
Elijah's fury wasn't loud.
It was precise.
He opened a new document on his laptop and titled it, The Gatekeepers, How Stanford Protected Gentry and Silenced Black Genius. He began assembling every piece of evidence, timelines, email screenshots, audio files, quotes from witnesses, institutional documents. It wasn't an article. It was a weapon. He was building it not for sympathy, but for reckoning. And the closer he got to finishing it, the more one thought screamed in his mind. They didn't just try to erase me. They trained the system to erase people like me. And then his phone buzzed again. A message from Carlin. Check this. Just posted internally. He clicked the link. It was an internal Stanford document. Meant for trustees. Leaked by someone. Maybe another whistleblower. Subject, Incident Containment. Elkins Gentry Allegations. It outlined a strategy. Deny authorship theft. Reposition Gentry as misunderstood genius. Frame Elijah as disgruntled former student. Offer Raymond early retirement in exchange for NDA. Reassure donors that inclusion remains a top priority. Elijah stared at the screen. They weren't just defending Gentry. They were trying to buy his father's silence. He picked up the phone and called Raymond. His voice was tight. Did anyone from the university contact you recently? A pause. Then Raymond's voice, calm, tired. They offered me a severance package, he said. Said it was in recognition of years of loyal service. Offered to bump my pension. But there was a condition.
What?
Raymond hesitated. They wanted me to sign a non-disclosure. Said it was standard procedure. Elijah clenched his jaw. Did you sign? Raymond's voice didn't waver. No. The silence between them was long. Heavy. Sacred. They think we're for sale. Elijah finally said. Raymond let out a slow breath. They've always thought that. Elijah leaned forward, eyes burning. Not this time. Because this wasn't just about Stanford anymore. It was about every institution that used the word diversity as a mask for exploitation. Every professor who quoted Baldwin but silenced the black voices beside them. Every department that hung a Black History Month banner in the hallway, while blacklisting black students behind closed doors. And every genius who never got their name on the page because a gatekeeper decided they didn't look the part. Elijah turned to his laptop, saved the document, and prepared to send it to every major news outlet in the country. He was ready. But then, another file dropped into his inbox, one he hadn't seen before, a video. Titled Raymond's Interview, 2003. Withheld by faculty committee. He opened it, and there was his father. Younger. Nervous. Sitting in front of a panel, answering questions about a possible custodial job. And then, mid-interview, someone asked, "Why do you want to work at Stanford?" Raymond's eyes were clear. "My son wants to study here. He's young, but brilliant. I want to be close. Maybe make a path easier for him. Elijah's heart cracked. They had buried everything, even this. And Raymond had been part of that pattern too long before anyone noticed. The air in lecture hall, C204, was dry and clinical, humming with the low static of intellectual performance. The kind of silence that wasn't born of reverence, but routine. 47 students sat in structured rows, pens poised, laptops humming. They were ready for another lecture on tensor symmetry reduction and its applications in modeling chaotic systems. At the front, Dr. Ethan Gentry adjusted his cuffs and cleared his throat. The arrogance hadn't faded with the pressure. If anything, it had calcified into something deeper, something defensive. He stood with a polished calmness, hiding the growing cracks in his public armor. He knew whispers had started swirling. He had seen the news stories, the subreddits, the Reddit memes, the resurfaced Reddit threads that refused to die. He'd fielded cautious emails from colleagues asking vague questions, avoided direct eye contact with a few faculty members in meetings. But still, he had tenure. And tenure, like a fortress, didn't fall easily. He tapped the projector remote. A slide appeared behind him, the same one he had used for years. The equation was familiar, central to his most cited paper, the same one that had built his career, the same one that had been pulled, line for line, from Elijah Elkin's erased dissertation. Gentry picked up a marker, turned to the whiteboard, and began rederiving the equation in real time. This was his usual trick: repetition, reinforcement, performance. And so if we contract over the upper and lower indices here, he said, gesturing with the marker, we eliminate the nonlinear anomaly. A single voice broke the rhythm. That's incorrect.
The words weren't shouted.
They were stated, calm, measured, certain. The entire room turned. A man had stood in the back row, dressed not in a student hoodie, not in a professor's blazer, but in all black. No ID badge, no affiliation visible, just presence. Ethan paused. He squinted into the backlight and blinked. Elijah? He said before he could stop himself. Murmurs spread through the class. You recognize me, Elijah said. That's good. Saves us time. The room froze. Some students recognized the name. Others pulled out their phones, fingers already racing. Ethan stepped forward. This is a private lecture. No, Elijah said. This is a public institution. And this equation, he pointed to the board, belongs to me. Gasps. Gentry laughed nervously. That's a bold claim for someone who walked away from the program. I didn't walk away. You erased me. The room fell silent again. I submitted that exact derivation to you in 2014. I have the files, the metadata, the time-stamped drafts, the audio of you admitting it in committee. And I have the video of you calling it visionary during a departmental seminar. Students were now actively filming. Elijah didn't stop them. This is the equation that made you famous, Dr. Gentry, he continued. It opened doors for you, got you speaking invitations, grant funding. It won you the Einstein Memorial Chair. Ethan held his composure like glassware on the edge of a shaking table. You're confused.
No, Elijah said. I'm done being confused. I'm the author. You're the impersonator.
Ethan looked at the students. Their eyes were wide. Their phones were angled. Their silence was not deference anymore. It was doubt. I never took credit for any student's work, Ethan said quickly. If anything, I helped shape it. Then why did you delete my drafts from the archive? No answer. Elijah walked toward the front of the room slowly. Measured. Not angry. Just undeniable. Why did you convince the committee to label me a voluntary withdrawal? Why did you republish my work under your own name, with reworded citations? Why did you tell the department no one would believe a janitor's kid came up with this? Gasps again. Louder now. Gentry's face flushed. Elijah stopped at the podium, looked at the board. He picked up a red marker, crossed out a term in Gentry's derivation. This minus sign here, he said calmly. It breaks the symmetry, creates a false convergence. That's what I pointed out in that video. He turned to the students, and he mocked my father for it. Called him broom boy. Phones shook with every frame. Then, another sound, the click of a shutter. From the back of the room, a woman in a blazer stood up, a press badge around her neck. It read, Stanford Press Office. Elijah turned. You invited the press? She raised a hand. We didn't, but we were told this would be newsworthy. Ethan's face paled. You set this up, he snapped at Elijah. I exposed it, Elijah replied. And I did it without fake authorship, false recommendations, or deleting anyone's name from a file. He turned to the class. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for correction. For everyone who got erased because they didn't look the way a scholar was supposed to. For every black student told they needed a little more polish before they were worthy. A slow clap started at the back. One student, then another, then the whole room. Ethan stood frozen, silent. For the first time in his career, he was the one who didn't belong in the room. Elijah didn't bask in the moment. He turned, nodded to the press officer, and walked out. Calm, clear, whole. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. A golden hue washed over the campus that had once spit him out like a system defending itself. But now the system was unraveling, and he wasn't the only one pulling the thread. Because as he crossed the quad, his phone buzzed again. An email from a name he hadn't heard in years. Dr. Michael Fortner, a respected tenured professor who had disappeared quietly in 2013 after a disagreement with administration. Subject line, "They did it to me too. I have my own files. Let's talk." Cameras were rolling, and this time so was the Stanford press. By sunrise the next morning, Stanford wasn't a campus, it was a battleground of narratives. Elijah's confrontation with Dr. Ethan Gentry had exploded across every social platform before most of the faculty even had their morning coffee. The clip was clipped, stitched, remixed, and reframed. Some users edited it with slow zooms on Elijah's face as he corrected the equation. Others added subtitles and screen caps of Gentry's previous op-eds praising academic mentorship and the transformative power of diversity. The irony was lost on no one. The hashtags came fast. Equation height. Stanford stole my son. Erased and replaced. Not just one equation. By noon, a crowd of nearly 200 students had gathered in the quad, waving signs that read, "We are not your image campaign. Justice for Elijah, and brilliance doesn't need tenure." At the center of the lawn, a podium had been set up, unofficial, student run. The mic was taped to a camera tripod. A young black woman stood with a megaphone, reading a prepared statement. This isn't just about one professor. This is about a system that sees black minds as disposable until they become useful to white names. A cheer rose. The administration was caught flat-footed. Their first press release offered little, a generic promise to review any and all allegations brought forward. But by the second hour, screenshots were leaking. Emails, meeting notes, whistleblower testimonies. Students had formed Reddit coalitions. Faculty group chats were now being infiltrated. Screenshots dissected. The university's silence had become its loudest confession. Inside the faculty lounge, chaos bloomed. Department chairs argued about damage control. A few professors tried to deflect. Let's wait until we have all the facts. Others, particularly junior faculty of color, demanded immediate action. And then quietly, resignations began. 2 co-authors of Gentry's most cited paper stepped down from departmental committees. 3 graduate students submitted letters asking to be removed from mentorship under Gentry's lab. One bold undergrad stood in Gentry's classroom that morning and said, "I won't be taught by a thief," then walked out. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a reckoning. But amid all the noise, there was one voice no one had heard yet. Raymond Elkins. For years he had existed in the shadows of this campus, sweeping floors beneath accolades and names that would never include his own. But now that silence had become the final puzzle piece. The last unknown, until he agreed to speak. When Elijah called him that morning, his voice was calm, steady. "They want me to go on record," Elijah said. Raymond had paused for a moment. "Then, you should. They might come after you. They already did. A long time ago." Hours later, in the same small break room where janitorial staff kept their lunches, Raymond sat on a folding chair wearing the same uniform he'd worn for 20 years. A local journalist set up a single camera. A student from the Black Student Union volunteered to film on backup. A third-year journalism major drafted the questions. No makeup, no script, no lights, just truth. "Mr. Elkins," the student began, "do you believe Stanford stole your son's work?"
Raymond didn't flinch.
"They didn't just steal his work," he said. "They stole his right to belong. They stole years from his life. And they tried to steal his name." His voice was deliberate, almost quiet. "But they didn't just do that to Elijah," he continued. "They did it to every student who came here hoping to be more than a checkbox. to every black mind that dared to challenge what genius looks like. The room was silent, except for the hum of the camera. Raymond looked down at his hands. The calluses. The creases. "I used to clean rooms where students scribbled equations on the board," he said. "Sometimes I'd finish the equation in chalk. I'd leave before anyone came in. I didn't want credit. I just wanted to feel it again." His voice cracked slightly. "I gave up my career for my son," he said. "I used to teach, back home, community college. Had a master's in applied math. But when we moved here, things got harder. Doors didn't open. So I took the job they offered. Mop in hand, head down." A pause. "I thought maybe if I stayed close enough, Elijah wouldn't have to fight as hard. I was wrong." The clip hit the internet before the sun set. And when it did, something broke loose. The footage of Raymond sitting in his uniform, confessing with weary dignity that he had once been a teacher, that he had stayed close to protect a son the system tried to erase. It shattered whatever thin veneer Stanford had left. Because Raymond wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a father, a scholar, a ghost they failed to bury, and America saw him. The reactions were swift, visceral, viral. Celebrities tweeted, "This man deserved a lecture hall, not a mop bucket." Professors across the country began reevaluating their own departments. One black academic posted, "Raymond Elkins is every brilliant black thinker we silenced because he didn't wear the right jacket." But the moment that changed everything came when an anonymous former board trustee leaked a confidential document to the media. It was dated the year Raymond applied to Stanford, a redacted portion now unredacted. It read, "Mr. Elkins' math background is not compatible with custodial work expectations. Recommendation: discourage interactions with faculty. Maintain low visibility assignments." The nation paused. Raymond had been flagged not for incompetence, but for competence. For knowing too much. For daring to exist beyond what the university thought his role should be. In the days that followed, Stanford's board issued a rare emergency session. Students began occupying the administration building, demanding Gentry's resignation and the reinstatement of Elijah's academic standing. The university offered to reopen Elijah's file. But the tide had already turned. This wasn't about one equation anymore. It was about the system that decided who got to hold the chalk and who was only ever handed the eraser. And in a quiet home just outside campus, Raymond sat at his kitchen table, hands folded, as Elijah read aloud the latest headline. "Stanford janitor reveals he was once a math professor. Institutional bias exposed." Raymond didn't smile. But he did say, softly, "They know now." Elijah looked at him. "No," he said. "They're just starting to." Because Elijah wasn't finished. He still had one file left to release, one that would show the world just how far Gentry had gone to protect his legacy, and whose silence he'd bought along the way. And what Raymond revealed stunned the nation. Raymond Elkins didn't believe in keeping trophies. He believed in silence, in modesty, in not making himself visible in spaces that were built to pretend he didn't exist. But he also believed in proof, and proof, over the years, had quietly gathered dust in the old storage closet, tucked behind the maintenance wing of the engineering hall. A place no professor had ever stepped inside, and no administrator ever checked unless something leaked or broke. The space was rarely used. A spare mop bucket, extra uniform patches, broken fans, but behind a gray metal utility cabinet with a flickering out-of-order sign taped to it, there was a small lockbox bolted to the wall, disguised under a fake HVAC panel that Raymond himself had installed years ago. Elijah followed him into the corridor in silence, unsure what his father was about to show him. "You said you've been watching me all these years," Elijah said, voice low, trying not to let emotion crack it. "But I didn't know you were collecting." Raymond didn't turn. "I wasn't collecting," he replied. "I was documenting." He pried off the old panel with a thin screwdriver, revealing the narrow black lockbox behind it. No digital keypads, just a physical padlock. He pulled out a worn brass key from around his neck, tucked inside his shirt, the only personal item he'd ever worn with his uniform. Click. The box opened with a metallic sigh. Inside were tightly wrapped stacks of yellowed paper, all bound with twine and meticulous care, spiral notebooks, envelopes, scans of whiteboard equations, doodles, margin notes, lesson outlines. At the very top, resting like a time capsule artifact, was a black and white photo. Elijah, age 11, beaming at a handwritten chalkboard full of equations. His father's hand just barely visible in the corner of the frame. Elijah took it, his fingers trembling. I don't remember this. You don't need to, Raymond said. I do. Raymond pulled out one notebook, its edges curled, the cover soft from age. He flipped it open. Inside were dated pages, each entry carefully titled, Week 3, Linear Transformations, and Their Failures in Real Systems. Week 5, Elijah's Conjecture on Tensor Simplification, Tentative but Promising. Week 9, His Speed Scares Me Sometimes. Must slow him down, before Stanford eats him alive. Elijah read each line like it was a letter from a past version of himself that had been waiting to be rediscovered.
How long did you keep this up?
Raymond looked at him. From the moment you solved that first equation on the kitchen wall, to the day you walked out of this university. You were mentoring me? All that time? Raymond didn't blink. Not mentoring. Protecting. Guiding. I didn't know how else to keep you grounded. You were running faster than the world would let you. In the back of the box was a folder marked Gentry. Inside, carbon copies of letters Raymond had written but never sent. To the department head, warning that Gentry was coercing student authorship. To the graduate oversight committee, outlining missing attribution records. To an unnamed faculty ally, pleading for someone to look into what he called academic laundering. None of the letters had been mailed. Raymond had written them, dated them, then placed them here, behind the panel, behind the mop bucket, behind the silence. Why didn't you send them? Elijah asked. Raymond looked away. Because I was a janitor, he said softly, and a janitor's complaint is just noise. Elijah's jaw clenched, but he kept turning pages. Diagrams, email printouts, curriculum maps, all annotated. And then at the very bottom, resting under a sealed plastic sleeve, was an envelope. Cream-colored, unopened, heavy. It was addressed in Raymond's familiar block letters. To the Stanford University Ethics Committee. To be opened only when my son is ready. Elijah stared at it. What is this? Raymond hesitated. It's the only time I ever let myself believe that one day, someone might listen. He stepped back. I wrote it after you left. After they erased you. I didn't think it would matter. But I kept it. Just in case. Elijah peeled back the flap slowly. Inside was a 6-page letter. Typed. The words were crisp, measured, bleeding with honesty. The letter detailed everything. The nights Raymond would walk past the math lab and see Gentry inside with Elijah, pushing him harder, faster, always guiding but never giving credit. The meetings he overheard through vents while cleaning, where department members discussed redirecting Elijah's research. The night he found a discarded printout of Elijah's dissertation in the staff room trash, with Gentry's name scrawled across the top, but the final paragraph was what stopped Elijah's breath. I did not raise my son to be famous. I raised him to be seen, and if this letter is ever opened, it means the world has finally decided to see what they once chose to ignore. You may be an institution of excellence, but excellence means nothing without integrity. You stole something from him, now return it. Elijah sat down on the floor of the closet, legs numb, the letter shaking in his hands. It was all here. The final nail. Not from him, from a father who had been silently archiving injustice like a librarian of loss. He looked up. We send this now. Raymond nodded. You sure you're ready for what comes next? No, Elijah said. But it's not just about me anymore. They stepped out of the closet together, carrying the box between them like a sacred record. Outside, the hallway was still quiet, but the air had changed. There was one more place Elijah needed to go. One more confrontation left. But before he left, he scanned the contents again. One thing stood out. A copy of Gentry's first published paper, the one that had gone viral in the academic world. But in the margin of Raymond's printout, underlined in red ink, was a handwritten line. Compare this to Elijah's draft. Word-for-word replication in sections 3 and 6. AI won't catch it. But human eyes will. It was the sentence that would change everything. The final thread in the web. Elijah pulled out his phone and started drafting the email to the national media. He attached scans, audio, letters, photos, and the letter from Raymond, attached in full, with the subject line, From a Janitor to Justice, the truth behind the equation. But before he hit send, another notification popped up. A new email from Dr. Ethan Gentry. Subject: You win. Let's talk. One-on-one. At the bottom was a sealed letter, addressed to the Stanford Ethics Committee. The internet didn't just catch fire, it detonated. Within 24 hours of Raymond's letter to the Stanford Ethics Committee being leaked to the press, The narrative exploded across every major news outlet, transcending academic circles and becoming a national reckoning. CNN ran the headline, "The Janitor Genius Father's Hidden Math Journal Sparks Stanford Scandal." NPR framed it as, "Erased the black scholar who rewrote a field," and was written out. Even the New York Times broke its weekend editorial schedule to print an op-ed titled, "What Genius Looks Like When It's Not Wearing a Suit." What shocked the public wasn't just the theft, it was the clarity of the cover-up, the documented metadata, the sealed letter, the audio of Gentry's own words dripping with disdain. Nobody will believe it came from a janitor's kid. Social media swelled with fury. The hashtags morphed from protest into movement. Justice for Elijah. Raymond wrote it. Credentialed but criminal. Math stolen too. Within days, more than 70,000 students and alumni across top universities signed a petition demanding federal academic oversight into elite university authorship practices. Another petition called for Stanford to immediately strip Dr. Ethan Gentry of his titles, honors, and tenure. But it wasn't just digital outrage. Corporate donors to Stanford began pulling funding. A major tech firm announced the withdrawal of its $5 million research grant. Another quietly but decisively suspended a partnership program that had placed their employees into the same department that fostered Gentry's breakthrough. One donor's representative was quoted anonymously in Forbes. "We didn't invest in the theft of black intellectual property. We invested in progress. And this was a betrayal." Stanford scrambled. Its PR department released a formal statement. "We take all allegations seriously and have initiated a full review. While we cannot comment on ongoing investigations, we remain committed to equity, inclusion, and intellectual integrity." It was too late. The receipts were public. The footage was real. And most damning of all, the people were speaking, not just Elijah and Raymond, but others who'd long been buried in institutional quiet. A dozen former black grad students came forward, 3 ex-faculty, even 2 former trustees. The cracks had turned into a collapse, and yet in the eye of the storm, Elijah wasn't celebrating. He was focused. He watched the media coverage with caution, always aware of how quickly institutions pivot from denial to performative redemption. He wasn't interested in Gentry's job being sacrificed for Stanford to save face. He wanted the structure exposed, all of it. Still, when the email came from the Senate Judiciary Education Subcommittee, his breath caught. Subject: formal invitation, testimony on academic ethics and racial bias. The hearing would be public, televised. A congressional forum titled, "Intellectual Erasure and the Gatekeeping of American Genius." They wanted Elijah to speak.
They wanted Raymond to.
And, as confirmed by the final sentence of the email, they had summoned Dr. Ethan Gentry to appear on the same panel. Elijah printed the letter, sat in silence, then walked to the kitchen where Raymond stood steeping tea. "They want us in D.C., he said. Raymond looked up, said nothing for a long moment. Then, "They didn't listen for 20 years. Now they want the soundbite." Elijah folded the letter. "I don't want a soundbite," he said. "I want them to say our names. Correctly. Publicly." Raymond gave a slow nod. "Then let's make sure they can't ignore us again." The days leading to the hearing felt surreal. A media convoy parked outside their duplex. Offers came pouring in. Book deals, documentary pitches, lecture circuit invitations. Elijah turned them all down. He wasn't finished speaking on his own terms. Meanwhile, Gentry went silent.
No press statements.
No video denials. Only a single report, leaked to The Atlantic, that said he had retained legal counsel and was reviewing all public statements made by former students. Elijah laughed when he read that. "You can't copyright stolen thoughts," he muttered. But behind closed doors, Elijah prepared carefully. Not just for testimony, for war. He practiced his statement line by line. Not rehearsed, but surgical, clear, precise, measured with the same patience he'd once used to write proof. The night before the flight, Raymond walked into Elijah's room and laid something on the bed. It was the original copy of his thesis. Not a scan, not a salvaged draft. The one Raymond had reprinted from old USB backups. Bound, clean, with Elijah's name in gold print across the front. Elijah picked it up slowly. "This is mine," he said. Raymond nodded. It always was. The next day they flew to Washington. And just outside the Capitol building, as cameras flashed and protesters gathered, a stranger pressed through the crowd and handed Elijah a letter. No words, just paper. It read, "This is bigger than Stanford. Other universities are starting to cover their tracks. I have files. I was paid to keep them quiet. I'm ready to talk. No name. No return address. But the final line chilled him. You're not the only one they tried to erase. And Dr. Gentry, he was summoned for a televised hearing. The congressional chamber was colder than Elijah expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Polished, clinical, cameras perched on every angle, red lights blinking steadily, like judgmental eyes. The official seal of the United States hung above the panelists, a silent reminder that this wasn't just a university scandal anymore. It was now a national indictment. The seats were packed. Behind the rows of senators and aides sat journalists, education activists, legal observers, and rows of students who had flown in from campuses across the country wearing shirts that read, "Genius doesn't wear a badge." In the front row, Raymond Elkins sat still, composed, his blue custodial jacket folded carefully on his lap like a flag. Elijah sat 2 chairs down from him, his hands folded, the bound copy of his stolen thesis, resting on the desk in front of him, like a weapon forged in silence. On the other end of the panel sat Dr. Ethan Gentry, his tie perfectly centered, his eyes glassy but stoic. To the untrained eye, he looked calm, but Elijah saw it, the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, the slight quiver in his left hand, the kind of tension that only appears when the ground beneath someone's legacy begins to split open. The subcommittee chair, Senator Valerie Nguyen, of Illinois, called the hearing to order. This committee has convened today to examine allegations of intellectual theft, academic erasure, and systemic racial bias within American higher education. We are joined by individuals directly affected by these issues, some of whom have become central figures in what is now a national moment of reckoning. She turned. Elijah Elkins. You may begin your statement. Elijah took a breath. He didn't reach for his notes. He looked up. My name is Elijah Elkins. I was once Stanford's youngest black PhD candidate in mathematics. But that's not the story I'm telling you today. The room fell still. I'm here because I was erased. Because my work, my original contributions to the field of tensor symmetry reduction, was taken, stripped of my name, and republished under someone else's. And because when I tried to fight back, I wasn't just ignored. I was systematically removed. He paused. But I'm not just here for me. I'm here for every black scholar who's ever been told, you're not quite ready. For every janitor who solved problems in silence. For every student who became a footnote in someone else's rise. He turned toward Gentry. I'm here for my father, who they tried to keep out of rooms he was smarter than. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Elijah reached for his thesis and opened it. This is the work they said I never submitted, the same work that was later used almost word for word in a published paper by Dr. Ethan Gentry. He slid the copy across the table to the chairwoman, who passed it to a clerk. Then he lifted a small USB drive from his pocket. And this, he said, holding it between 2 fingers, contains audio recordings, metadata, and time-stamped correspondence proving authorship. It also contains meeting transcripts in which Dr. Gentry referred to me as a risk, and said, quote, nobody would believe a janitor's kid did it anyway. The silence in the chamber thickened. Gentry cleared his throat, leaning into his mic. With all due respect, Senator. You'll have your time, Senator One said firmly. Let Mr. Elkins finish. Elijah's voice softened. Look, I don't want to see anyone ruined. That's not why I'm here. But I do want to ask this country a question. What does justice look like when the theft isn't just material but intellectual? When what's stolen is a future, a voice, a name? The room exhaled as one. The chair turned to Gentry. Dr. Gentry, your response. Ethan leaned forward, eyes narrowed, lips tight. I do not deny that Mr. Elkins was a promising student, but the equation in question was developed over years of collective departmental research. Many scholars contributed. Attribution is a complex process, not when the paper is copied line for line. Senator Nguyen cut in. You published solo, sir. Why? Gentry faltered. Because by that point Mr. Elkins had voluntarily withdrawn. His name was no longer on record. Because you erased it, Elijah said quietly. Gentry froze. And for the first time, the camera caught it. The unspoken truth behind his eyes. He knew. Raymond sat forward in his seat. Not angry. Just steady. I cleaned your floors while you lied through your teeth, he said quietly. Do you know how many times I heard you brag about that equation? About how you wrestled it into shape? Gentry didn't respond. because there was nothing left to say. Senator Nguyen looked at Elijah. You've outlined the injustice. You've proven the theft. But I want to ask you directly, what does justice look like for you? Elijah inhaled, and his answer stunned the room. I don't want Gentry fired. Whispers exploded instantly. I don't want him cancelled or humiliated. Elijah continued, eyes focused. Because that's too small, too convenient. I want a systemic change. I want universities to be forced to track intellectual property from all contributors, not just the tenure. I want third-party oversight on authorship. I want policies that don't allow ideas to be stolen because of who's allowed to sign the paper. He leaned in. And I want my father's name, Raymond Elkins, added to every math department's wall of legacy thinkers. Not as a custodian, as a mentor, as a contributor. Raymond looked over at his son, eyes wet. That was something no apology could touch. Senator Nguyen nodded slowly. That, she said, is justice. But Elijah wasn't done. He reached into his bag once more, pulled out a printed email. I received this 2 days ago, he said, from a former university contractor. They worked in data sanitization, paid to purge archives across multiple universities. He held up the page. It lists other names, other students, other ideas, hidden, buried, repackaged, sold. Gasps. I've handed this to investigators already. Because if Stanford was willing to erase me, how many others are out there, whose names we'll never know? A storm was already rising again, outside the chamber. And Elijah had just lit the next fuse. Because Elijah wasn't done yet, and he had one last reveal. The plaque was small, clean, bronze. It read, in recognition of Raymond Elkins, scholar, mentor, father, whose equations lived in silence until the world learned to listen. It was bolted just outside the mathematics department lounge at Stanford, right next to the framed portraits of distinguished faculty. Only this time, the face wasn't in a blazer. It wasn't posed with arms crossed, surrounded by degrees. It was Raymond, in his janitor's uniform, chalk in hand. Mid-solution. For the first time in its 34-year history, Stanford had inducted a non-faculty member into its academic legacy archive. Not as a token, not as an exception, but as a symbol of every person the system underestimated, overlooked, or quietly erased. The university's public apology had been carefully worded. We failed. We apologize. We recognize the trauma. There were hearings, reforms, task forces. But that wasn't the real justice. That came in the form of action. Gentry was stripped of his chair title. His publications retracted. His tenure review opened for investigation. But Elijah hadn't asked for vengeance. He'd asked for recognition, structural change. And it began. Stanford under pressure from alumni, watchdog groups, and a rising generation of students established the Elkins Authorship Protocol, an academic integrity initiative, ensuring all contributions, regardless of title or status, must be logged and credited in any research project conducted under its name. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Still, the most powerful shift wasn't in the policy, it was in the students. Within weeks, lectures changed, conversations opened. Black and brown students who had once stayed quiet during research discussions now spoke with more certainty, more weight. Professors learned to sit back and listen. Departments started reviewing old authorship disputes, this time with new eyes. And then there was the scholarship. Elijah launched it quietly. No press conference, no sponsor gala, just a website, a mission statement. The Janitor's Formula, a scholarship for underrepresented Black mathematicians, whose talent defied credentials, whose ideas needed protection, and whose futures deserved to be their own. It didn't take long for the fund to flood with donations. One came from a former professor who had once dismissed Elijah's early work. The note attached simply said, "For what I missed." Another came from an anonymous donor. 6 figures. No message. But the routing information pointed to an endowment once managed by Gentry himself. Raymond didn't say much during those weeks. He returned to his routines, still waking early, still carrying himself with quiet dignity, but he no longer swept hallways unseen. Now students stopped him, shook his hand, called him Professor Elkins. Once a young freshman approached him in tears, clutching a copy of the op-ed that had changed everything. "My father's a janitor," she whispered. "I thought I had to hide it. But you made me proud." Raymond didn't cry. but he did rest a hand on her shoulder and say, "Don't let them shrink you to fit their comfort." One afternoon, in the back room of the math department, a whiteboard was left partially erased, an unsolved equation scrawled halfway through. Raymond stepped inside quietly, picked up a marker, and filled in the rest. He didn't wait for applause. He just nodded to himself and left. Months later, a new textbook was released. Modern Chaos and Tensor Dynamics, Theory and Legacy, co-authored by Elijah Elkins and Raymond Elkins. It became a bestseller in academic circles. Not because it was easy, but because it was undeniably theirs. Every chapter opened with a note on credit. Every diagram was watermarked with initials. And in the dedication, one line stood alone. To the minds they called too loud, too fast, too unrefined. This is yours too. But Elijah still carried one memory with him. Not of the courtroom, not of the applause, but of a storage closet, a dusty journal. And the moment he realized his father hadn't just watched his fall, he'd mapped the whole descent, and waited. Not to catch him, but to prove the ladder had always been missing rungs. On a quiet fall morning, nearly a year later, Elijah returned to campus. Not for a lecture, not for a headline, just to walk. He paused outside the engineering building, where his father once cleaned during graveyard shifts. The place looked the same, but something was different. He noticed a door ajar. Inside, a young janitor, maybe 19, maybe 20, stood alone by the back whiteboard. He had headphones in, a mop in one hand, a marker in the other, and he was writing, line by line, slowly, carefully, solving something that didn't look simple. Elijah didn't say a word. He watched. The janitor looked up, startled, then quickly wiped the board. "Sorry. Just messing around." Elijah smiled. "You get it right." The kid shrugged. "Maybe." Elijah stepped forward. "You want to be a mathematician?" The young man hesitated, then nodded. "But I don't think I'll ever get in here," he said. "No one in my family even went to college. And, you know," Elijah handed him a card. "The janitor's formula. Full scholarship. Next year," Elijah said. "You won't need a mop to enter this building." The janitor stared at the card, speechless. And as Elijah turned to leave, he felt a presence. Someone watching. From the end of the hallway, just beyond the glass. It was a woman. Tall. Quiet. Holding a file. She didn't speak. But Elijah knew that face. It was one of the admin assistants from the university archives. She held up the file, nodded once, and disappeared down the hallway. He stepped over to the board. Read the equation the kid had nearly finished. And for a moment, just one, he saw himself again.
Not erased.
Not stolen, but seen. But the final shot? A new janitor quietly solving an equation on a whiteboard, and someone watching from the shadows. Some stories don't need a twist, just the truth told out loud. Rayna was punished for saving a life, because of what she looked like. If you've ever felt invisible doing the right thing, this story was for you. Type yes, if you believe black heroes deserve better.